Well, I asked you to open to Matthew chapter 6. If you haven't, please do so. We are finishing up my series on what it looks like to be a missional church, and I'm going to end on the issue of possessions and money. And some might wonder, how does that fit into the missional life? And it's really quite simple. Everything fits into the missional life. But money and possessions are one of those unique things that have a way of capturing our soul, and we don't like to admit it. If you remember, my very first sermon on this whole series was out of John 20, verse 21, where Jesus said, "As the Father has sent me into the world, so I also send you." And I said that one of the things that we have got to understand is that we have been sent into this world. We are a sent people. We don't just exist here and do nice things and live out our life and then die, but we are to be seeing ourselves truly as missionaries sent into this world. Where we live and where we work are where we are called to do our work of ministry. Well, one of the major criteria of living in this age and in this world is simply the reality of money and possessions. And it is something that Jesus was sent into the world, and he lived a specific kind of life, and he taught much about the issue of money and possessions, and he has sent us into the world to carry that same attitude, mindset, and lifestyle in our lives. That is our mission, that is our purpose. It's built into the very name of our church, Missio Dei being simply Latin for the mission of God. But when we talk about money or possessions, it is probably the greatest external indicator of spiritual health, but we don't oftentimes think of it that way. It is the one thing that over and over again the Bible brings up in the way of instruction, in the way of warning, and in the way of illustration. In fact, warnings abound about the way money can capture our hearts and minds, and how money and possessions can move us toward sin and actually eventual destruction. It's not commonly understood or known, but Jesus spoke more about money and possessions in the Bible than heaven and hell put together. If you were to ask yourself what was the most common topic Jesus spoke about in relationship to our souls, it was money and possessions. Money itself, though, is neutral, and we ought not to ever view it as anything but neutral. It's not evil, it's not good, it's just simply a barometer of our soul. Our actions reveal our heart. In fact, one of the things that happens to me just as a pastor is I'll be talking to people, expressing maybe a concern in their life, and those are never fun. I don't look forward to them, but I'll have people say, "Well, you don't know what my heart is. You can't see my heart." But the reality is, all I have to do is really just look at your actions and a few other things, and I can have a pretty accurate understanding of your heart, and you can know the same for me. In fact, two different places, Christ says specifically there are ways to know our heart. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, he says, "For the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart." Your mouth reveals your heart. The second is our treasure. In Matthew 6:21, in the passage we'll look at today, where your treasure is, there also will be your heart. And so today what we're going to look at is what is really very simple and very clear words of our Lord on the topic of money and possessions, and then seek to consider how that relates to our lives in service to Him. So understand that. We're not going to look at hard to understand passages, very simple one. So follow along, and I want to read verses 19 to 24 of chapter 6 of Matthew. I want you to just notice what is being said and nothing more. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. Now again, notice how clean and clear it is. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now this is a brutal passage, and I freely admit that. I know it, and the things I'm going to say today may come across at times brutal. And I want you to know that I'm aware of that, painfully aware of that, but I also want you to know that it doesn't really matter, right? We are either people of God's word or we're not. We are either submitting ourselves to it because it is what God has for us or not. The reason this is so brutal for us is we are Westerners, and it truly has a way of exposing for us idols that we don't want to talk about or even admit. In fact, strangely enough, it is one of the few passages that I have taught over the years that elicits the greatest amount of rationalizations, excuses, arguments, rejections, and accusations thrown back at me. It's just strange about that. I'm not really shocked myself, but whenever I have talked about just about every subject under the sun. I don't think I've ever shied away from anything. And I've never, ever faced the level of pushback that I receive when I preach something like this. Now, that's not my way of trying to head off something that you might have a concern over or a complaint. I'm just simply making that as a simple observation for you, that this is a kind of passage that rips down all of those walls that we like to put up and all of the camouflage that we put over our hearts, and it reveals for us things that we don't want to necessarily look at. And the natural reaction is to argue, push back, or to rationalize those things away. I ask that you try not to do that as we go through the text. Rather, I pray that you would even ask right now before the Lord that your heart would be sensitive and you would hear, just hear. So what we're going to do is nothing exciting or magical. I want to take you through the text itself, because it's so simple and so clear. In fact, it's so simple and clear that I think we make it harder than we ought to. And so I want us to just look at the text. What's it say? How does he make his argument? And then after that, we'll look at some observations and applications that I would ask that you would consider before God. The first thing I want to tell you is that this passage tells us that what we treasure defines where our heart ends up. Let me repeat that. In verses 19 to 21, what we treasure defines where our heart will end up. It's not necessarily where it is now, but whatever you treasure, that's where your heart will end up at. Verses 19 and 20 show, very simply, a negative and positive command from Jesus. Now, hear that word. Don't let that word pass by. I said a negative and positive, and here's the word, command. If you don't have it written into the margin, you ought to. These are commands. This is no different. Jesus is making no different here of a statement than he does if he were to tell you to not lie or to not murder or to not to commit adultery. This is a command from our Lord. So get that one, first of all, in your heart and mind, is that we're looking at not something that he is just discussing, tossing out there, or in the latest jargon we like to say, that he wants to have a conversation about. He doesn't want to have a conversation. He is telling us bluntly and blatantly, this is what you are not to do, and this is what you are to do. And so if you are disregarding this passage, you're just simply rejecting and disobeying the one you call Lord. Now, he gives it in a negative, as I said, and a positive. The first is the negative. He says, don't store up anything that is considered treasure on earth. Don't store anything that is considered treasure on earth. And he uses the word for earth here, the word gas, which you're like, so what? Well, Matt Miller talked about the word cosmos earlier in a couple of sermons ago. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't. Cosmos is a word that is also translated as world, and yet it's talking generally, it has a lot of meanings, but generally it's used to talk of our fallen, sinful condition. It talks about this age that we live in. The word geis literally means the rock that we live on, this thing called the planet Earth. So it's actually emphasizing the physical location. So he says, don't store anything that's considered treasure here on this planet. And then he flips it and he gives the positive, do store it in heaven. Now, he gives reasons why you're to do it. And again, it's very simple and it's very clear. It requires no special knowledge to be able to understand. He says that the reason you don't is that you will lose what's kept here, and you can only keep that which is in heaven. In other words, the nature of this broken world, this world that's filled up with that fancy word that Matt uses, havel. Remember, that's that Hebrew word out of Ecclesiastes that means that broken, twisted, fallen, vanity, futility that is just part of living in this world that we live in. That because of that, it's guaranteed to be lost. In fact, the way he constructs this in his grammar, just to look at the grammar, it's what's called a present active indicative. Let me just break that down real quickly for you. What it means is it's an ongoing reality that it's actively taking place. It's not a potential. It's not something that might happen, but it is something that is an ongoing activity. And it is a fact or a reality. In other words, what he is saying then is if you store up your treasure on this planet, it is a fact or reality that you cannot escape that it will be lost. It's that simple. No maintenance plan, no insurance plan, no buying guide will guard you from losing it. You will lose it. All of it will be destroyed, not just some of it, not just if you're not careful. It is simply a reality, he says. It will go away. And the opposite is just as true if you invest it in heaven, store it in heaven. It is utterly and eternally safe. In fact, it is as safe as your soul is for every one of you here who is blood-bought by Jesus Christ. As safe as your soul is in Christ, so is your treasure in heaven. But understand this, in verse 21, it makes this brutally clear. It is not about your money. It is not about your treasures, and it's not about your things. It really is all about your heart. And so verse 21, he says, for, and I've taught you well enough on that. When you see the word for at the beginning of a verse, you add a few extra words in your mind. For this reason, right? Now he's given us the reason. So for this reason, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So it's the indicator now that he makes the point. So what we want to know, and I've heard so many sermons on this passage about money management and giving, and it's not really about money management or giving. It's about worship, and it's about idolatry. Wherever your treasure is, he says, that's where your heart will reside. Now I want you to notice again the verbs. I want us to just pause for a moment and notice that there's a verb change in this verse. The treasure already is presently residing somewhere. It's present. It is either on earth or it's in heaven, but it's there. Wherever that treasure is, whatever you want to call your treasure, I won't even bother with that. Just treasure. Wherever it is, it's already there. But then notice the verb shifts to the future for your heart. So because of your placement of your treasures now, your heart, if that treasure is left unchanged, your heart will end up there as well. And remember, your heart speaks of that which is you, that which makes you a person. It's your heart, it's your mind, it's your intellect, it's your will, it's your emotions, your dreams, your thoughts and intentions. It's everything that's that invisible quality of you that makes you a person. It is the core of you, the essence of you. You are commanded in the Scripture to guard your heart, to watch what goes into your heart, to not trust your own heart. And what he says is wherever you presently have your possessions, if you do not change that, your heart will end up there no matter what. Now, you have to wrap your head around this, because here's how it works with many people when they think about this passage. They're thinking about the treasures that they have, and they're not going to tell you what they are because maybe they're just trying to hide them and put on the proper face, but they're thinking about the treasure that they have, whatever it is, and then they look at their current spiritual condition and they think they're doing pretty good. They're certainly doing better than some of the people they know maybe in the room. And so they're not too concerned because they look at their present condition and they say, well, my treasure is here, so I must not really have it here because my heart condition seems to be fine. But that's not what the passage is saying. It's not saying look at your condition now and then just keep doing what you're doing. The only thing you're to look at is where is your treasure? Where is it? And then know this. Given time, your heart will be there. So it doesn't matter if you think you're doing good now. The reality is wherever your treasure is, that's where the heart ends up. And that's what makes this so sneaky. Because you can talk yourself into anything because you're currently doing good, but the reality is your treasure still is over here on this planet. And he says the problem is that your heart will end up there. And great will be your grief. This is so important, and I hope that it's making sense. Because what happens then is that you end up in a situation and a place that you never expected. Now understand, we are the wealthiest nation in the entire world. In fact, if you didn't know this, we are the wealthiest nation ever in the history of mankind. Most of us would never think of ourselves as filthy rich, but the reality is every one of you is. You make more money than the wildest dreams of most people alive today. In fact, the people in this church spend more money on their phone plan than most people make in an entire year. Just get that one through your head. Your phone plan likely costs more than what most people in this world would make in an entire year. I'm going to go to Ethiopia. It's a poor nation. I'm going to have a translator, and he is my friend, Demeke. And Demeke will be standing with me, and I know how much he makes a year. And I will have in my pocket more money than he makes in that entire year just to cover incidentals. More than 1 billion people right now live in absolute poverty. And by the way, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I want you to grasp. If you've already thought, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't have treasure, you got treasure. Especially if you have something parked in the parking lot. You have treasure. You're doing good. 700 million people currently living in slums of untold poverty. 500 million people on the verge of starvation. 93 million true beggars, not what you see on the on-ramps and at intersections here in America. The 200 million children who are exploited for labor, not to mention the sexual deviancy of people. These are not just poor people who can work their way out of their troubles. That only works in places like America. These are people who have literally no hope and no opportunity to improve their horrid situation in any way. They don't wake up and think, if I just can do this or do that, it will get better. It won't. It can't. There's nothing in place for them to have that. Now, you compare that to these statistics. 18 years ago, in 2000, the American evangelical, those are the people you would potentially have the best chance of actually calling and being a true Christian. The American evangelical collectively made $2.66 trillion in income. Did you know that it's more common that the amount a Christian puts aside into savings and investments and retirement each month is greater than what he gives to the work of the Lord? I'm not here to pry into your private details. I'm just asking you. If that's true, where is the treasure being stored? When it's forbidden, and we're pouring all of it for there rather than the work of the Lord. And again, I'm not here to try to make you feel guilty, but I am here for you to understand that we are called to be in this world as Christ was sent into the world. And we are called to view this age and our life in a way that's radically different than our neighbors. And we are to ask ourselves, why does God enrich us in a way that's not like our neighbors? Did he enrich you so you can get that second piece of property? Is that why he enriched you? Did he enrich you so you can upgrade the cell phone plan? Did he enrich you so that you might be able to get that boat you've always wanted? What is it that he's enriching you for? What is the purpose? As a blood-bought slave to Jesus Christ, why are you so wealthy? That's what you have to ask. Why am I this way? What has God done this for? And what is my calling as one who has been sent just like Jesus? Now, let's make some observations then and applications. First of all, realize he's talking about our treasure. Our treasure is that which is above and beyond our needs. And if you ever wonder, well, what are my needs? In verse 31 of the same chapter, he describes the basics. What will we eat? What will we drink? And what will we wear for clothing? Food, water, and shelter is essentially our needs. And frankly, it's not saying that owning a home is sinful or anything else. It's not even getting into it. It's just talking about your treasure and what is it that you're storing and where and what it will do to you as a result. But understand that he's not talking that somehow you're not allowed to have a nice meal. He's not saying anything about that. He's just talking about that which is what you have in abundance. Our heart is unable, he is showing us here, our heart is unable to withstand the pull of our treasure. Think about that. He doesn't say that where your treasure is, your heart may become. He says, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. We cannot resist the pull of what our wealth and our treasure does to us if we place it in the wrong place. It will pull us the wrong way. It's how we worship. We have to guard it. Have to guard our heart, I mean. He also, it's interesting, assumes that we all have treasure. And he's not against treasure and wealth. In fact, in Deuteronomy 18, he says that he is the one who gives us the ability to make wealth. But what he is concerned with here is where do we store our wealth? Because where we store it will result in how we worship. Now, you've heard this story, many of you, in the past, but let me repeat it because I think it's still a good story. I was raised in the church. I was going to church in my mother's womb. And I was taught that you were to give, and I hated it. And I obeyed because that's what you were supposed to do, and I knew it. But I will tell you the truth. I believed every time I put money in the plate, every time I thought I was losing that money. Every time. Every time I wrote a check or just put cash in or whatever it was in my stage of life, whenever it happened, my heart was saying, you've lost that money. And the hard reality is the only money I ever lost was the money I kept. And once that clicked for me, once that made, not only did it click, but it made sense, I was free. It was only then that I could then begin to be more generous because I was realizing I'm not losing anything here. He doesn't say that you are to store up your treasure in heaven for others. He says literally, it's incredibly self-centered. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourself treasure in heaven. That the only money or the wealth or the treasure that I keep is that which I gave away. And once I got that, it changed so much. And it's still a battle. I mean, I'm no different than you or anybody else, and I'm not God's gift to any of that. I just want you to understand that I know how our minds work. And we can say, well, I'm really good at this, I do this, and I do that, and I'm supposed to, and I'm okay with that. But have you gotten to the point that you understand that you literally are losing nothing that you give away for the sake of God? And that is just the way God works, isn't it? Let me just kick out a few passages and just show you how backwards walking in the way of God is. He says that if you wish to save your life, what shall happen? You're going to lose it. But whoever loses his life will save it. So in God's economy, the way you save your life is by losing your life. So it's okay to want to save your life, but the only way to save your life is to lose the life in Christ, and then you save your life. And you're like, that makes no sense. Yeah, well, that's how God works. And he's serious about it. So he says, if you want to be first, you shall be last of all, in Mark 9:35. Or in Mark 10, he says, whoever wishes to become great shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first shall be slave of all. That's how God works. And it's so counter to our existence as humans. And most definitely it's counter to our Western way of thinking, isn't it? To be that servant, to be a slave, to die to ourselves, to lose our life in Jesus Christ. Or to give away our treasure for the sake or the work of the Lord, that we might store it for eternity in heaven. So the issue here is about storing up our treasure. It's not how well you obtain it. It's not on how to maintain it. In fact, listen and hear me on this. There are those people who are so very careful how they spend their money and how they maintain their things. They get more out of each dollar than the average human being, and they're very proud of that. In fact, they will look at others who are not as careful, and they'll cluck their tongue, maybe only in their mind, but they'll think, if you were just more careful, you could have, and then fill in the blank. The problem, though, is that if you're one of those and you're being ultra careful with your money, is it so that you might be more generous? Do you see the rub? Where you're watching your investments grow, and you're saying, well, I'm on track now that when I retire, I will be able to have. In fact, I just heard a news blurb last week that experts, whoever they are, have determined that the minimum for happiness in your retirement years is $105,000 a year income. I'm like, not 106, 105, that's it. So you need to talk to your investment counselor and find out, what does it take for me to get $105,000 so I can be happy and then die and lose it all? But that's just the mindset. We gotta plan for this. We gotta take care of that. But the reality is if you're not understanding that all of that is so that you might become more generous, then all you're doing is just storing your treasure here. You're just doing it in a very well-maintained manner. But it's still here. The issue is not where future treasures will be stored either. He's not saying later. It's your present treasure. The promise is that wherever your present treasure is, that's where your heart's going to end up. I remember talking to a young man who was just finishing up college. He had amassed quite a bit of student debt, and he was telling me about how, we can't really give right now because, we just got not making much and we got to service the debt and take care of it. But don't worry, because if I'm on track for where I'm going, in another 10 years, I'll be one of your biggest givers. I don't know why he thought he should tell me this, but he did. And I just looked him in the eyes and I said, if you're not giving now, you won't give then. It's because it has nothing to do with how much you make. It has nothing to do with your debt. It has everything to do with your heart. And things got kind of uncomfortable in my backyard at that moment. The challenge built into this statement is this. You and I are to determine now to shift our treasure out of this planet and into heaven. It's that simple. To change your focus from this world to another world. To understand that this world is passing away and all of your trophies will go away with it. But if you learn to treasure a different place where Christ is and you begin to invest in that place, then your reward will be yours for eternity. So that's brutal reality number 1. Brutal reality number 2 is in verses 22 to 24. And that is that what we set our heart upon defines what or who we worship. Verses 22 to 24, what we set our heart upon defines what or who we worship. Now, understand that Matthew 6 is all about this. If you want to have an interesting little moment, some of you maybe have already done it. I have a new preaching Bible, but my old one, if you were to look in Matthew 6, you would find the word repay or pay or reward, like it says in verse 1. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. If you were to just circle that and then draw your line and find all of the places it talks about that, you'd see that that's a consistent theme all the way through. He's not saying that you can't have reward. You will get your reward. He says, if you want to have everyone see you pray in public and think that you're so godly, even though there's nothing in your heart toward God, he says, then you got your reward. You got it here and now, but for all eternity, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. He says, there's just this reality of how things work, and that's what he's getting at with our possessions and our treasures. You can have it all now, but you'll have none of it in eternity. And you're like, well, that's not so bad. I don't care. I still got heaven. Actually, no. There's every chance that you won't have heaven, because it's all about really not your money, but your heart and worship and idolatry. What you desire is a clear picture into the state of your soul. And so if you desire that which is good, your soul pursues and grows toward it. That's what verse 22 is saying. It's talking about the eye. It's what's meant by the eye and it being clear. And if you doubt me, just look at verse 24 where he sums it all up. What we set our eyes upon as desirable and good and satisfying shall define what we worship and love. In fact, Matthew 20, we won't turn there, but I'll just make reference to it. In Matthew 20, it's a parable about the kingdom of God, and so it's really got to do with something more than money, all right? It's got much more to do than money. And it's a reality that the grace of God is such that it's not fair. Grace is never fair. Grace, thankfully, is never fair, or you would be in hell. And he talks about the landowner who hires people for a denarius to work in his vineyard for a day, and then he goes out and finds some more later on in the day who are still needing work, and he sends them in. Finally, he gets these guys who are, the day's almost all done, he still finds them. He says, go into my vineyard and work. And when it's done, he calls them all out, and starting with the ones who were hired at the end of the day, he pays them, and he gives these people a denarius, a day's wage. Well, everyone behind them have been there longer, and they're all thinking they're going to get more money because, hey, if these guys got a denarius, we're in the money today. And then he gives everyone else a denarius too, and they're all angry. And he's like, why are you angry? Other than the fact that your heart is filled with greed. The hard thing about that is, as an American, that speaks to something else. We would think of that as unjust, and you know what, we need to negotiate this, and no way. But the reality is that we don't understand what grace looks like. But as just a simple illustration for you and I, it is how we oftentimes view our money and what we are worth and what we deserve? Are we a people who delight in the mercy and kindness of God, and out of that comes the overflow of our heart and our giving? And I'm not talking necessarily about giving to the church. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying your heart, is it a generous heart because God has been so generous with you? Or are you thinking about the things that you didn't get or you think you should have gotten? If you desire that which is not of Christ and eternity, rather you allow yourself to be defined by this age, and that's what your eye gazes upon and yearns for, then your soul and actions will follow, verse 23 says. What the eye finds delightful defines the condition of your heart. See how similar it is to the other one? What your eye is gazing upon, what you're yearning for, what it is that you think about when nobody else is around, what it is that you dream about, the thing that you're working so hard about, the thing that you maybe don't sleep well about. Maybe it's the thing that making you make decisions in your life as to how you're going to work or your spouse is going to work or where you're going to live or how you're going to spend. What is it that captures your thinking? It will tell you the condition of your heart. If the eye delights in that which is good and right, then the heart is filled, he says, with light. But if it delights in that which is selfish and evil, he says, it's a very great darkness. And that is a salvific idea. It's speaking to the situation of your soul. That on the external you can make a profession of salvation and a profession that Jesus is Lord and that he is your God and that you desire him and him alone. But the reality of it is that what your heart is set upon, your eye, what you're gazing upon and yearning for and working for, tells you the exact opposite. If the eye is full of the glory of the gospel, of the greatness of his forgiveness through Jesus Christ, of the hope that is to come, then your heart is full of that which would be called light. But if it's of this world, of those things which you cannot or do not have, of taking all that you can because you are what matters, then he would say your heart is dark indeed. In other words, a good eye ultimately sees that God is more desirable, not your mouth, your eye, what it gazes upon. A good eye is a discerning eye. It looks at what is being presented and considers it in light of how it affects his relationship to God. I've used this illustration in the past. A guy in our church many, many years ago, he's actually dead. I remember him saying, well, hey, we're looking to buy a ski boat. I don't know why he thought I should know that, but he shared it with me. I said, oh, okay. He's like, well, I just wanted you to know that we want to use it for ministry. So if anybody wants to go out on the lake, anything like that, we're happy to take them out on the lake. I'm like, okay, I don't know of any lake ministry we're planning, but gotcha. I told him, I said, why are you buying it? I mean, it's Wisconsin. I mean, you can only use it a few months out of a year. I said, why are you buying it? He's like, well, no, it's going to be for ministry. I'm like, all right. I said, is it going to affect your coming to church? Well, no. Yes, it did. They never were there during the summer. They taught their children that the church is for us when we have bad weather. But if it's good weather and we can be out on the ski boat, we're there. Untold things were taught. He's now dead. The children are nowhere. I have no deep message in there. I'm just saying, the eye that's clear thinks carefully, very, very, very carefully as to what are the possible effects of what is maybe an innocent sounding decision but its gaze is looking at all the wrong things. Will it enhance that relationship with God? Will it promote the glory of God in this world? See, a good eye discerns whether the thing being offered is truly beautiful and truly excellent, or it's just another cheap imitation that really is only designed to destroy. Think about Eve, and she looked upon the fruit that was forbidden, and it says that she saw that it was desirable to make her wise, and she ate. Or think of King David as he's up on his castle looking down, and he sees the woman Bathsheba bathing, and he does not avert his gaze, and the end result of it is that he ended up as a murderer, an adulterer. Do you think that he had that on his calendar for the day? Think about Achan. He was part of the men who went into the city of Jericho having been told, destroy everything, it all belongs to me, the Lord, do not take anything for yourself. But he saw some gold and he saw some silver, and he said it was desirable. And so he took it and he hid it, and the next battle, Israel lost, and then the next thing you know, he and his entire household are being killed. It's just a little money. Right? It's just a little this, it's just a little that. And we are so good at our rationalizations. What is the condition, beloved, of your eyes? Is it filled with darkness, or is it filled with light? And don't be too quick to answer that. Just consider that. What does it gaze upon? God has given us all the ability to make money, and he has given us the ability to enjoy the benefits of money, and there's nothing wrong in that. But God has never given to us the right to love money, hope in money, or delight in money. That is reserved for God. And so what do you treasure? Do you treasure God or possessions and money? And if you say God, then I would just simply say this. How then is that evidenced with your possessions and money? Is the place that you're storing it showing what you say is your passion? It's a fun passage, isn't it? Isn't it just fun to hear? It's really fun to preach, too. Whatever it is that you desire, he says in verse 24 is this. Whatever it is that you desire, whatever you set your eyes upon, that's what you will serve. Because you can only have one master. Again, brutal. It's because it won't allow you to find a little hiding place for your rationalizations. It's impossible, he says, to desire God and to desire money or possessions. It's impossible. And the reason it's impossible is God made it that way. We forget so often that there's not a way that we can circumvent the rules of this age, because God's the one that made the rules. So if you are trying right now to somehow figure out how you can desire money and desire God, give it up. Give it up right now. If you are thinking that if I can just get that next raise and then it'll be fine, you're just living a dream that's not even a dream. It's just an eventual nightmare. Here's some examples of what I mean. The one is that it can come in the form of trying to minimize your risk. You hide it in the religious sounding words of things like this. Well, God wants us to be a good steward, doesn't he? It's like, no, he doesn't. No, he wants you to be a bad steward. He wants you to be a wastrel. Oh, of course he wants you to be a good steward, but why does he want you to be a good steward? Are you being, quote unquote, a good steward truly so that you can give more, or so that you might be safe? You see the difference? The Lord teaches us in this passage how to pray. Give us this day our daily bread, right? When was the last time you ever prayed for your daily bread? And that tells you how wealthy you are. You're so wealthy, you don't even give it a thought. You are so wealthy that you know when you go home that you have so much food waiting for you that some of it will end up in the garbage. Right? You have not prayed that God might provide you the meal in ages. Because your life is built around minimizing risk. So you never know what it looks like for God to provide. I'm not here to rip on you. I'm just saying at some point we get that through our head and we make decisions, and those decisions are risky in the eyes of this world. In fact, the more risky they look, the more I would say that you ought to at least consider them just in light of trusting God. I'm not saying you be reckless, but I know that that's never going to be our problem, being reckless. It's learning to trust God enough that we will be more generous. Do you live a life trying to minimize your risk so that you're not possibly harmed? Not that it will ever happen, just you don't want it to happen. Second, maybe you try to figure out how much you have to give just to get your conscience to be quiet. These are actual conversations I've had with people. I didn't really care for that sermon. It really made me think, and it started making me think that maybe I'm not giving like I ought to give, Pastor. I just like your counsel. All right, what can I help you with? Well, how much should I give? I don't know. And why are you asking me that? And the hard reality is that all you're really wanting to know is how much do I got to give so I don't feel guilty anymore? And at that point, you're missing the point, right? Give whatever it is that you need, you believe you should give, and then if my free cheap counsel, give some more. So figure out, well, what do I think I ought to give? Okay, I'm going to give more than that. I mean, whatever, I don't know. I won't do that for you. I just want you to understand that you only have one master, and you're serving him. One of them you're serving. I don't know what it is. It doesn't have to be money, and it doesn't have to be God. It can be sex. It can be power. It can be comfort. It can be safety. But you got a God. Somebody, something that you're serving, every one of you, because it's guaranteed you must serve somebody. And it's all of eternal importance. Because money and possessions will define who we worship and what we follow. Remember the rich young ruler of Matthew 19? He comes and he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What good thing must I do? And then Jesus says, obey these commands. And he says, well, I've done all of those commands since my youth. And he says, okay, one thing you lack. He says, sell all of your possessions, give it to the poor. And he says, and you will have, do you remember what it says? Treasure in heaven. Oh, just like this. And he says that the young man went away very sad, for he had much wealth. And then Jesus says, it is hard for what? A rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And as I said to you, you're all really, really rich, whether you know it or not. All he did was, he wasn't teaching salvation by works in that passage. All he did was show that in spite of all of his goodness, his heart was serving money. Because if his heart was to serve the Lord, then he would have given it away. So let me bring us all to a close. I have found that a common concern expressed by Christians is that they don't have a heart for the things of God. That would be probably my most common conversation with people is, I go out with you, how you doing, what's going on, how's your heart, how's your spirit, how's your life before Lord, something like that. And I consistently hear people say, it's okay, well, what's that mean? And you just start asking, and it starts to come out that their heart is just not for the Lord as they desire. So what's the answer? What would be a pastoral answer? What answer would you give to that person when you take them out for lunch and you just inquire and they're like, man, I'm having a hard time? Well, the answer is going to be twofold. I would say to you, find where your treasure is first. And that's going to require brutal honesty. Find out where is your treasure. And then I would say the second thing you have to do is systematically and prayerfully begin to shift that location of your treasure into eternity, and the promise is that your heart will follow. I think that one of the great errors we have is we are waiting first for God to give us the heart to invest in the eternal things. But the opposite is true. He doesn't say, wait for me and I'll give you the heart and then you can do it. Rather, he says, you obey me and then I'll give you the heart. Do you see the difference? Obey me and I'll give you the heart. And you're like, yeah, but I just don't feel. Well, then you'll never get the heart. So I thought about suggestions that I could give to you, and I really decided not to, at least in any kind of detail, because ultimately, as I told the other congregation, you guys are adults. You've got to make these decisions on your own. You have to be a man or woman living under true convictions and submit to the right action. So I'm just going to pose a few questions and then I'll let you go home. First, how are you storing your treasure on earth? If you have treasure, where's it being stored? I only ask that because I want you to think about where it is. And you might be surprised. It's in your IRAs, it's in jewelry, it's in new vehicles, it's in clothes that you wear hardly at all. It's in books that you never read. I wrote that one for me. It's guns that will never be fired. It's land that you'll only sit on for a couple times a year at most. Wherever it could be. There's some people who would be shocked if they would look at the amount they give to the Lord and compare it to the amount they spend eating out. First of all, I would simply say this. Ask yourself, where am I storing my treasures? Second, ask this. What do you desire? What do you desire? What's in your heart of hearts? And here I'm only can trust that the Spirit of God will work in that way that only a Spirit can do. But I can tell you this, if you want to know what you desire, go find your treasure. Okay? Just go find your treasure. Because that's where your heart's going to be. I'll throw this one out at you. Is it possible, just possible, that the reason that you never seem to have enough is because you have no eternal perspective with regard to your wealth? Is it just possible that the reason that you never quite are making it is because you've never become content and developed a true perspective of what money exists for in the life of a Christian? So I'll ask a different way. Is it possible that God is taking what should be cheerfully given to him and taking it from you through breakdowns, poor health, interest rates, or thefts? Is it possible? Just a quick story there. Again, this back in LA, and we didn't have a lot of money. We really didn't, and I had a very cold heart toward the things of giving. And in fact, I had to actually ask my good friend who worked right next door to me in the other office that when I became truly convicted of this, I said, I need you to come in every Monday and I need to show you my checkbook that I wrote my giving. Because I seem to always remember everything but the giving check. And he was one of those kind of friends. Showed up every Monday, let me see your checking book. And he just did it. But I remember before all of that, he was the one that posed that question to me. We couldn't remember we were going through washer and dryers like nobody's business. Every time I bought one, it broke. I'm like, are you serious? And this was really crimping us because I made $7.50 an hour and I paid $800 a month in rent and all this other stuff. I was just like, man, but I wasn't given anything. Is it possible the Lord was just taking from you what is his because you won't just give it to him? And you get no reward for that. And then finally this, we are called to give in accordance to the grace that was shown to us by God. So let me ask you a final question. What does your giving say about the grace of God in your life? How does it model the grace that has been shown to you? These are just questions for you to ask. I would ask that you would consider them. I would ask that you would go home and consider what it means to not store up our treasure on earth and to have an eye that is clear before the Lord.